He says, I suspect that fairy tales and Santa Claus do prepare us to embrace the ultimate fairy tale, the one C.S. Lewis believed was ingrained in our being.
Hmm.
New research from the Université de Montreal and the University of Ottawa indicates that children aren't overly troubled upon learning that Santa is a myth. But the researchers remain puzzled because while children eventually abandon Santa, they keep believing in God. Lewis would say this is because God is real.
Mm. Well, bringing up C.S. Lewis, of course, reminds me of how C.S. Lewis became a Christian, and part of him becoming a Christian was because his mind was baptized by fairy tales. It's a phrase he would use, and he talks about his conversion from atheism to Christianity. It was a journey, but at one point, he's in his book Surprised by Joy, he describes these conversations that he had with several classmates, including J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, who was a Catholic. And Tolkien, as they're arguing basically about the possibility of God, Tolkien says to Lewis, both who were very well read. Not well read doesn't even describe those men, but in fairy tale and myth. And Tolkien says to Lewis, don't you understand? This is the myth that is real, the myth of all myths. And that was the stone in Lewis's shoe. As you know, Greg Kokel talks about putting a stone in people's shoes. That was a stone that Lewis could not shake. And so this is appealing to that kind of what I mentioned earlier, that fairy tales help us in realizing there is this world that we cannot see.
Yeah. And Santa Claus is one of the fairy tales of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And how can it prepare us to embrace the ultimate fairy tale? Well, I mean, you think about Santa and the fairy tale of Santa. You have this individual who knows if you've been naughty or nice, right? Has a certain amount of knowledge. Right now, of course, and again, this is where, because we as evangelicals don't have a theology of imagination, okay? And we haven't been taught how to incorporate, fairy tale and myth into our education. And modern education has done us a great disservice this way. Again, like you've already mentioned, read Lewis, read Tolkien on this, but Santa, the fairy tale of Santa Claus starts to give us these pictures and these concepts that start to lay a foundation, or as I think I said earlier, it kind of tills the soil of the heart and mind. It's kind of preparing us for the real thing. And so here you have Santa Claus. And again, with young children, the imagination can be such a good tool because they have a hard time. Their minds aren't developed where they can think as abstractly as, teenagers and adults. So if you're going to try to talk to your kid about God's omniscience or his omnipresence, that's just a little more of an abstract concept versus Santa Claus, who knows if you've been naughty or nice. That kind of takes omniscience, a part of omniscience. And of course, we would not say it captures the whole truth, but it's the seeds of the whole truth. And so thinking in terms of something like Santa Claus and myth and fairy tales and all of this as a development of the imagination that will prepare the heart and mind ultimately for the real thing. So you see, so you've got other parallels with like Santa and God, right? The generous nature of Santa, the Santa giving without receiving, right? I mean, no one. Someone might say, "Well, what about the cookies?" Oh, okay, give me a break. That's not really reciprocal.
Well,
That was a delayed laugh, Erin. It was a really delayed laugh. I just want to highlight that. I was expecting an earlier laugh, and that kind of threw me off because I thought it was pretty funny.
well, I'm thinking about what you're saying about the modern church. And I think too, don't you think part of why we've maybe pushed away or gotten so defensive about myths and fairy tales? Because that's what I think I would say. It seems like Christians almost will get defensive about, stories where there's witchcraft,
Or especially if there's magic.
Things like that. So this push again, but
Throw out the Chronicles of Narnia.
Right. Because not only is Chronicles of Narnia have a witch in it, it also has Santa Claus because Lewis sticks Santa Claus in there. But don't you think part of that reaction is because we have moved away from the arts as a church too? Because art brings in an aspect of wonder.
Yeah.
You have to sit and contemplate art, whether it's poetry or pictures or whatever it is, and it provokes in you a wondering about what the artist is, because the artist is putting something in front of you to think about, whether it's musical notes or words or whatever, again, pictures. Yeah. And so the church has basically unhitched from the good and beautiful part of God in that way, because art, it is that good and beautiful piece.
Yeah.
And so we've detached from it. So it just becomes this utilitarian, almost just this, like, if it's not useful, then we don't need it.
Yeah, useful in the next 2 seconds.
Right. If it's not, yeah, and even useful, it's like, well, what does that mean? Because we're human beings, so there's all kinds of aspects about us. But I just think this move away has been partly because we've moved away from art as a whole in modern times. Yeah.
So because of that, I think you're onto something there, and because of that, the imagination is not developed.
Yes.
It's not developed, or it's underdeveloped. And this is why, maybe one of the reasons why Christians produce such bad art. And not, of course, not everyone, but if you look at the history of Christianity in Western civilization compared to today, there's no comparison, right? And so, yeah, I think we've failed our people that way. Now, I think that gets us into these other quotes here. Okay, so
real quick, I just want to say, and adults might be cursed because of modernity, or we adults might be messed up because of modernity.
Yeah, speak for yourself, Erin.
But children don't have this problem. This is what children have no problem with imagining things they can't make sense of.
Yeah.
And often it'll be that we squelch that in children instead of cultivating it, which is what we're talking about today, is actually cultivating your child's imagination and hopefully your own along the way.
Yeah.
But children don't have this problem. This is why they love fairy tales from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Because this is part of the imprint of God in each of us, right? We have this natural bent towards wondering and imagining things that aren't right in front of us.
Yeah, and this is where there's kind of current discussion in the church about enchantment and disenchantment, and how our culture disenchants us with its worldview. But we live in an enchanted world that's filled with the supernatural, the magical, if you will.